2016, January 2016. The year has begun with my friend and neighbor, Delina's annual New Year party, a gathering together of old friends. It is markedly less crowded nowadays, and those that manage it up the stairs are grateful for the resulting availability of seats. I feel positively sprightly compared to one guest with a broken femur, another a failed back operation, two stroke survivors, and an assortment of less than successful hip and knee replacements. The general trend of the conversation was increasing inability to learn lines, the depressing type of roles that we were being called on to play, the lack of projection in younger actors, and shock horror that some are actually being mic'd. Good thing, too, I think, makes life so much easier. The moans were conveyed with loud hilarity at past adventures and present ills. One erstwhile brew was still relentlessly flirting from the sofa, undaunted by the fact he couldn't get up off it. Old age was mocked and defied by this joyous gathering. February 2016. No one demonstrates the resilience of the old better than my sister Billy. After a lifetime of working in variety and cabaret all over the world with her husband, Roy, they retired to live in Norfolk, where he could no longer work on the stilts used in their act. Billy had no roots that could be called home, as we moved about so much as children, whereas her husband's family, led by his father, well known northern comic and theater owner Roy Barber, were well established in Lowestoft and Blackpool, which is why Billy and Roy opted to set up home in the north. She did her best to settle into the new way of life. When her husband died of a stroke, she stuck out a year living alone in the Broads, working in the local charity shop and trying to adapt to a nice little house instead of her touring caravan in her tiny flat or her tiny flat in Paris. She played with the neighbors' children, and as my father had done when he first lived in a house as opposed to digs, she created a colorful little garden. Suddenly, on reaching 80, she freaked out, put her cat in a basket, and went to join a bunch of friends from her past working life living in Antibes. Her best friends, Stella, a member of a distinguished circus family, and Nikki, a showgirl, model, half of a fabulous cowboy lasso act, and laterly dress shop owner, welcomed her with open arms, along with Juliana and Bob, whose enormous rare breed cats Billy cared for sometimes, staying in their luxury flat overlooking the sea. Her social life was a whirl, and as I discovered when I visited them, the most enormous fun. I organized a dinner party at her favorite local restaurant to celebrate her 90th birthday. Family and friends awaited her entrance, knowing that she had spent weeks getting her nails and hair done and choosing her outfit and jewelry. I was beginning to worry at the lateness of her arrival when a distraught Stella rushed in to say Billy had fallen and could not get up. My son in law was left to entertain the motley party guests with his fragmented French, while my daughter Ellie Jane and I dashed round to her flat. We found Billy on the floor. She struggled desperately to pretend she was okay and could go to her party, but was obviously seriously injured. In France, you call the fire brigade if you need an ambulance. And the drama of the incident was somewhat lightened by the arrival of two devastatingly handsome paramedics. Even Billy, who it turned out had broken her hip and was in agony, perked up to no end. After days of medical investigation, the doctor told us with a solemn face that at her age the likelihood of being able to walk again was minimal. But they would provide her with care and a wheelchair, or she could go into a home. Mercifully, I don't think he understood Billy's English swear words, but he did flinch slightly at the flashing of her eyes and her shaking fist. So my sister went into a splendid rehabilitation center where she insisted on going to the gym twice a day. A month later, she was walking round the grounds on the trainer's arm, and shortly after that, with merely a stick for support. She just refused to listen to that, well, at your age, what can you expect brigade. The trainer told me it was a complete miracle. Knowing my sister, I would categorize it more as complete bloody mindedness. March 2016. My professional life seems to have come full circle. The first theater to which I was contracted was the Theatre Royal in Oldham. It is no more. It was on its way to being no more when I worked there, fresh from drama school in 1951. The roof leaked so that the audience had to constantly move seats to avoid dripping rainwater, and the dressing rooms had no heating and cracked black pitted mirrors surrounded by broken light bulbs. Before entering, you had to bang on the door to tell the mice that their shift was over and they should stop eating the grease paint. Cut to 2016. We no longer use sticks of makeup made by Leichner, with numbers 5 and 9 mixed in your hand being the favorite for a natural skin tone. But the Southwark Playhouse dressing room I was in recently for a production of a musical called Grey Gardens was no improvement on the Theatre Royale. The mice there were very happy with crumbs of the Jaffa cakes that the cast were all addicted to. In fact, I have gone down slightly in dressing room status, as at least in Oldham the men and women were separate. In Southwark, we had one room for everyone, with clothes hanging rails draped with sheets down the middle to separate the sexes. Very soon any semblance of propriety was abandoned, and men and women alike pranced about in their underwear. On the face of it, it doesn't look like progress. I have luxuriated in the number one dressing room in the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and several other West End theatres. So surely it is a sad plight after 6 decades of work to be dumped in a rough and ready French theatre. Actually, not only was the musical a huge success, with people queuing for returns during its sellout run, but I loved every minute of being in the venue. To get backstage, you have to go through the bar where the audience are carousing before and after the show, which, if you're in a flop, must be an ordeal. But we had a but we had a ball. The show worked better than it would have done, and apparently did in New York, where it was behind a proscenium arch, because we had the audience seated around us within a touching distance, giving us actors a thrilling awareness of their deep involvement in the true story of these relatives of the Kennedy family, living in squalor with hundreds of cats, hating and loving one another intensely. One night I dried in a song and turned to someone in the front row saying, I've no idea what comes next. And he told me he'd seen the show several times. He loved it so much. It was theater as it should be. The venue is irrelevant as long as there is that mystical bond between a group of people and a story being told. Sadly, the Theatre Royal was demolished, but there is still a thriving theater, the Coliseum in Oldham. Southwark Playhouse and its mice are planning to move to two splendid new spaces in the area. I, too, am struggling on. May to June 2016. One of the big advantages of my chosen career for me now is that there is no retirement age. I am not suddenly deemed redundant and unable to work, so long as I can remember the words and stumble across the stage or set without bumping into the scenery. I might even be called a national treasure, or even a legend for managing to do so. On the other hand, on the day I reached 80, I was considered twice as likely to drive badly as the day before, thus justifying a doubling of my insurance overnight. A totally unproven assumption, as I revealed in a television program I made about the subject. Luckily, my profession continues to consider me employable, although the roles increasingly require me to die or go senile. One that didn't is the film I have made over the last 2 months that is one of the most fulfilling jobs I have ever had. When I was sent the script of Eddie, about an old woman who, having been for years the carer of her unlovable husband, decides on his death to go to Scotland and climb a mountain, I thought there must be some mistake. In my profession, I have always been a sort of also ran. I am happily aware that a bevy of actors has usually been approached for a part before they come to me, although nowadays the bevy is rather reduced as some have dropped off the twig. Despite my success in Grey Gardens, I know that a performance in a French theater does not carry much weight in the film world. This script had a wonderful part in a charming story, and I couldn't understand why the many actors ahead of me in the pecking order had not gobbled it up. I duly met the producer and director in a club, and they had indeed seen me in Grey Gardens and wanted me to play the role. I was about to hug them both, laughingly saying that, of course, the climbing will be done with green screen, won't it? Silence. The long and the short of it was that, no, they wanted me to actually climb the bloody mountain. All was suddenly clear. Many of my contemporaries have the afflictions of old age that would render such extreme demands impossible. And anyway, they have already done wonderful leading roles and would now prefer to put their feet up or work in a lovely studio with a comfy dressing room or at a warm location in a luxurious Winnebago. It is the mark of my still lethal ambition that I asked the producer to give me a night to think about it. I talked to the director of the health club where I occasionally did a gentle workout, asking if he thought I could get fit enough to climb a mountain in 3 months. He blanched, only slightly, and consulted his top trainer, whose whole life is spent breaking records of one sort or another, and who wasn't going to be defeated by my shriveled muscles and thinning bones. So it was all systems go. Every other day in the gym, lifting weights, speeding on the treadmill, developing bulges in arms and legs, which hadn't been there for years. In addition, I trained in Richmond Park with an ex-RAF officer at walking in bog and up and down slopes at the double. By the time I arrived at Lochinver, where cast and crew were to live together in a hunting lodge, I felt incredibly fit. We had a few days to get to know each other before setting off on the long trip to the foot of the Sullivan Mountain, filming scenes as we went. It was a challenge, stumbling over a bog full of horrific Scottish beasties, 1 minute falling flat on my face over a tussock, the next up to my knees in mud, is not what a nice English girl from Hammersmith is used to. All of the time looming ahead was Sullivan, getting bigger and bigger the nearer we got to it. Sulven is a curious mountain, rising vertically from the wilderness with an unusual plum pudding top, and huge. It took several days to reach its foot, including rowing over a loch, which is not the elegant gliding sport it appears to be, but rather takes all your strength and gives you blisters. And I had my first experience since the brownies of sleeping, or rather not sleeping, in a tent. On the first evening, in an effort to show the right nature loving spirit, I pointed out a pretty snake slithering past my door tent, only to have hysterics when one of the crew said it was poisonous. When I eventually staggered to the actual foot of the mountain, my legs were shaking more from fear than exhaustion. Seeing my stricken face, the first assistant took me aside and said, "This is your last chance to back out, Sheila. The climb is going to take 2 or 3 days, shooting as we go, and we will be sleeping in tents. Once you start, there is nowhere for a helicopter to land apart from the top, so you will have to continue." I looked at the first slope. The crew were already clambering up it, laden with heavy cameras and sound equipment. I had grown fond of these young men and women, and the thought of giving up and letting them down was out of the question. Achille Rubin, a man who knew everything about the geology and history of the landscape, was assigned to work out where I should put my hands and feet when scrambling over the rocks. He was concerned about my age and insisted that I have a break every 10 minutes, a plan which soon proved unfeasible for a low budget film. His technique to keep me going was, if I manage a tricky bit, to reward me with a jelly baby. Kevin Guthrie, who played my young friend, was endlessly solicitous. His main advice was, don't look down, for God's sake, just don't look down. The biggest problem for me was the absence of toilets. The mountain is bare of trees or bushes, so there's nowhere to hide. Plus, those Scottish beasties are waiting to bite your bum the minute you squat in their beautiful national park. To begin with, the crew were told to look the other way, but eventually I went native and behaved like other animals in the wild until Callum, a local man, came to my rescue. I am always fascinated by the effect the presence of a film unit can have on the residents of the location of a shoot. Usually it starts with suspicion and grudging cooperation. Not so surprisingly, as film units are a motley crew. They're clothed for the weather and usually unkempt and tired, and at the end of a hard day's shooting, they like a drink. In a remote place, it can be a frightening invasion of the usual calm and order. Thus it was in Lochinvar. The pie shop and the pub were pleased to see us, but the locals were wary of those rogue and vagabonds, as we used to be called. As always, when they became extras, the inhabitants were baffled by the boring repetition and long waits involved in the process of making a film. But once they got to know us, most of them were intrigued. There is always much laughter and affection that gels a random group of technicians and actors, all away from home and united in creating a piece of work. Sometimes a local person living a nice, comfortable, steady life finds it exciting. I remember several years ago a film unit descending on the village we then lived we then lived in Wiltshire, taking over the local manor house for the making of an adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. The manor's house's owner, a rather cantankerous old woman, at first hid away from the invading army, but was lured into eating on the carrying bus. The cheery, disrespectful ribaldry of the crew. "Hello, my darling, come to join the plebs, have you?" was something she had never been exposed to, and she fell in love with it. The humor, the dedication, and the albeit temporary affection enchanted her. When the circus moved on, I imagine she felt very sad, as we all do when a job ends. But for us, it is usual. In Lochinver, we were blessed with Callum, who was intrigued by our way of life. He lived and worked locally and started working as an extra with us, or as a supporting player, as we now call it, but gradually became indispensable. He was knowledgeable about the landscape and could turn his hand and mind to anything. He invented a plastic and wooden laboratory for me, which he would set up and conceal, and then stand guard while I used it. Callum told me our arrival had changed his life and he was going to rethink everything. He even played a small role in the film, proving himself to be a subtle and charming actor in his first part. He looked out for me, always warning me of the importance of keeping warm, hypothermia being a real threat for everyone of my age. One night I did actually think I might die. We had to camp on a ledge above the clouds. I had thermal underwear, several layers of clothes, hats and gloves, and a supposedly insulted tent. Insulated, a supposedly insulated tent. Here comes one of those superlatives I hate, but I mean it. I have never been so cold in my life. What I had forgotten when layering myself up was the state of my bladder. It was pitch dark with a sheer drop to oblivion outside my tent. Stripping off and crouching outside, trying not to wake anyone else, I was terrified and frozen to the bone. I spent the rest of the night with my teeth chattering. Yes, they actually do clack and chatter with cold. When I saw the sun peeping over the distant horizon at dawn, I understood why primitive man worshipped it. How anyone can think that camping is fun is beyond me. The last lap of the climb was the toughest. Crossing a meter wide, very long path with a vertical drop either side was the only time I actually wept with fear, my whimpering allayed by an extra helping of jelly babies. Jelly babies are like jelly beans. So every time she did something good, the trainer would give her a little jelly bean. After the final rock scramble, egged on by Kevin, flat on my stomach, I wriggled onto the top. In the script, when she reaches the top, Edie is supposed to whoop and dance in triumph, physically doing the climb, rather than mocking it up with technology, was justified when I realized that, although in terms of the story, jumping about and shouting seemed right, in actual fact, it was impossible. The sheer wonder of what I experienced as I stood on that unexpectedly grassy summit took my breath away, and I was struck dumb. Miles and miles of wilderness on all sides. No sign of life, not a road, not a house. Reuben pointed to a dark patch on the ground below and told me geologists had proved it to have been there since the beginning of time. Throughout my long life, I have had a few experiences that have shaken me to the core of my being. Transcendental, revelatory. This was one. I did not feel diminished, a tiny human being in this vast world. I felt part of it, absorbed, embraced, part of nature. I felt I belonged to this wild, bleak, magnificent place. My body had lain against the mountain's cliff face. I'd clung to it with my hands, trusted my feet on its stones, and it had befriended me. The sun was setting, and we needed to get it on the film. A helicopter took most of the crew off, as they wanted a final shot of Kevin and me with no one around. The pilot was agitated as we were above the clouds, and it was getting dark. The brilliant director of photography, August Jacobson, wanted a last shot from the helicopter. As it passed, the wind from its blades nearly blew us over the edge and scuppered the whole operation by killing off the leading characters. Eventually, they came back for us. The helicopter ride in the dark back to base was the most frightening part of the entire shoot. When we got back, there was drinking and cheering and loving and hugging. There is nothing better than the feeling that you have done a good job on something. It can be doing the ironing, arranging some flowers, making a child laugh, or climbing a mountain to film a good story. That night, a mutual sense of achievement was celebrated with joy. For me, I was aware that something profound had happened to my, I don't know, my soul. June 2016. Much as I love Scotland, I am glad to get back to London and indulge in my usual round of concerts, theatre, and long lunches with my mates at my slightly decadent bohemian club in Soho. My ecstatic reaction to the landscape of the Highlands took me by surprise. I think of myself as a city girl. I love the pace, the people, the easy access to cafes, galleries, theaters, and parks. In London, I enjoy the jangle of different languages, the kaleidoscope of ethnicity. I relish the unpredictability. I walk its streets and turn down some passageway and find a new muse or building I didn't know was there. It seems as amorphous mass, but if you live here, you know that it is a series of villages, each with its own character. Elegant Hampstead, Raffish, Spitfields, boisterous Brixton. Cities can and do absorb anyone. Areas change according to the influx of new people. Settlers in London have been Roman, Huguenot, Jewish, Irish, Jamaican, Arab, Somali, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Chinese, you name it, they've come here. Troublemakers have tried to stop this flow with their hatred and fear, but cities will continue to embrace change, which is probably why most of them would prefer to leave open the doors to Europe. The metropolitan elite is a label currently used as an insult, which, if elite is taken to mean aiming high, to be better, to be special, I embrace. These are things all of us should aspire to, for our country as well as ourselves. On Stuyvesant, that's a mountain, I felt that nature could be my friend. I had never really felt that before, always slightly on edge. I have gone on family country walks and admired the views, while secretly looking forward to visiting the nearest pub. I feel more relaxed in the hubbub of a city than in the quiet of the country. I am less frightened of passing a gang of seemingly threatening youths than of crossing a field of horses or even sheep. I hunt in full cry, shouting, blaring horns, baying hounds, is scarier to me than a noisy demonstration in Trafalgar Square. I am, I suppose, scared of the country, just as the folk who live there are appalled by London. I blame the war. As a child whose playground was bomb sites, I was more thrilled by collecting shrapnel, machine gun bullets, shells and bomb fragments than posies of wildflowers. When I was evacuated, it was the first time I had lived in the country. I was terrified of the monster cows in the field next door to my billet. I will still walk miles to avoid crossing a field in which they're grazing. However, peaceably. I am more at home in rural France because where I live, there are no animals in the fields. When I was a child, we left King's Cross to live in suburbia. Not only that, but my parents gave up working in hotels and pubs and took jobs that meant regular hours. My dad in a factory, my mom in a shop. I don't know how happy they were about that. My dad must have missed the boisterous companionship of being a landlord, but the decision could have had something to do with his partiality to drink, or two, or several. They also probably thought their children needed more stability, in which case where we moved to was not ideal. During the Blitz, Bexley and the area around it was known as Bomb Alley. It was organized to defend the armament factories, Vickers Armstrongs in Crayford, and the Woolwich Arsenal, as well as the docks. With the deafening mobile ack-ack gun behind the house, searchlights, barrage balloons, and constant dogfights as the Nazi bombers were confronted by Spitfires overhead, there was no lack of excitement. But when the war ended, I found Bexleyheath deadly dull. The bustle and noise of the pub customers in King's Cross, even the odd fight, the winkle and shrimp barrows on Sundays, the Salvation Army bands, the crowds, the buses, the trains that ran under our yard shaking the glasses were replaced by genteel calm. On country walks, if there are no actual people around, I will look for traces of them. Ruined tin mines in Cornwall, what is left of our mining industry in the Midlands and the North, old barns and farm buildings in the countryside. Halfway up Sylvan is a substantial dry stone wall. It serves no obvious purpose and makes no sense. Its origin is shrouded in mystery, but it almost certainly is what is known as a destitution wall. In the highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, many people were driven from their homes and land to accommodate a growth in sheep farming by the landowners. That, together with the famine, which devastated Scotland as well as Ireland, forced many to emigrate, and those who remained were poverty stricken. In order to receive meager subsistence, they were made to work on pointless tasks such as building unnecessary roads, the so called destitution roads. Most likely, some Highlander walked miles from a distant village every day and then climbed Sullivan with massive stones and constructed this monument to inhumanity. He used his skill and strength to create something beautiful. I imagine he ended up with more self respect than the man who tried to humiliate him. The landowner probably laughed with his friends about the ludicrous task he set the Highlander, but I suspect that to have daily communion in sun and storm with that magical mountain, crafting something that future generations would admire, means that the laborer had the last laugh. Alone as he was, he probably felt an affinity to nature. I remember when John used to ask me to join him looking at the stars at our French home. We no longer see them in big overlit cities. I would have a quick look and say, "Yes, lovely," and carry on cooking supper. He would stand there for ages. And I think now that he probably knew that feeling of being part of the universe, and I didn't understand it. How sad that I was too busy to try. On our last visit to our French home, when he was mortally ill, the week he stood stock still for over half an hour, looking at the view of the mountains, forest, and blue, blue sky. Then again, on the last evening, he sat outside, staring at the stars for a very long time. Is it any wonder that I now, 18 years after his death, still feel his presence, his energy? Can I ever, before my own inevitable death, set aside my sensible, rational approach to life and contemplate the inexplicable? June 2016.